Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this timely and important discussion. And thank you to Atkins for making this event possible. Now, the last 2 weeks, as I'm sure we're all aware, we've seen the world come together at COP26 in Glasgow with the intention of tackling the greatest emergency facing humanity. And we all know we need to cut carbon emissions by 50% over the next decade. This is a huge feat. Everybody has a role to play. So that's why I'm really excited to be here today with colleagues from the transport sector, because it's crucial that we work together, not just in our individual roles, but collectively to decarbonise, but also to prepare for the impacts of climate change that are already happening. And as the invitation for this event said, as you all saw, transport planners need to evolve into decarbonisation architects. And today we're going to hear from a number of people working in the transport sector about how we can do this. This week, the UK's Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, who we've all come to know through the COVID crisis, said that the climate crisis is a far bigger problem than coronavirus and would kill more people if immediate changes were not made. He said that while the pandemic had been awful, COVID might be a 2 or 4 year problem rather than a 50 to 100 year problem that could be really, really damaging. And I think that really helps us put climate change into perspective. But what the pandemic has shown us is that quick and dramatic changes are possible where there is political and social will. So as transport planners and decarbonisation architects, we need to be planning for extreme heat, which in cities around the world has tripled in recent decades. And the UK government has been repeatedly warned by its official climate advisors that the country is woefully unprepared for increased heat. Transport vulnerabilities to heat waves include the buckling of railway tracks, the softening, rutting and potential melting of roads, so that means more potholes and more dangerous roads, as well as train carriages and buses overheating. We also need to be planning for more torrential rain, intense storms and flash floods as a frequent occurrence. According to Sir David King, over £200 billion worth of assets are at risk around British rivers and coasts in towns and cities, and urban floodwaters are invariably mixed with sewage, creating additional risks to health and higher costs of repair to properties. Flooding in February last year alone cost £375 million to the UK insurance industry, and this is only going to get worse, far, far worse, unless we take drastic action. Roads tend to be impermeable, so the more roads there are, the more concrete there is, the larger likelihood of flooding. And as a result of vehicles being driven through flooded roads, roads are among the primary causes of flood-related deaths. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are solutions, lots of solutions that can improve our lives and improve our health and well-being while reducing emissions and protecting against the impacts of climate change. And that's why we're here today, to talk about these solutions. We're expecting 400 people, not just to join in with this webinar today, but following up afterwards, listening and watching this webinar. And that's 400 transport professionals who can take action to transform our transport system, to protect ourselves and each other from the impacts of catastrophic climate change. And I'm excited to get this conversation started. So I'm going to hand over to our speakers now. And we're really keen for all of you that are listening to input your questions. So we've got a question box on the side of the screen. Please type in your questions as we go along, and we're going to have a really, really good discussion. So you can see from the slide here, we have 4 fantastic speakers, and I'm going to start by introducing Jonathan Foster-Clark, Senior Transport Strategy Advisor at Atkins.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, my screen has appeared. It was a bit slow in responding. Thank you, Caroline, for the intro. One thing that we've learned from COP26 is that we need to work quickly to get on with delivering steep cuts in carbon emissions from transport. I'm a senior advisor in transportation at Atkins, and we're taking this very seriously. We're working with local authorities across the UK and beyond to help them to deliver deep reductions in their carbon emissions and to prepare for a just transition. Next slide, please. And activists have made clear this week that time's up for blah, blah, blah. And it's not just Greta. Young people around the world are telling us to get our act together. We've had reports from different agencies that we aren't going fast enough. This graph from the Climate Action Tracker shows that there's still an enormous gap between solid pledges and a 1.5 Celsius pathway. In fact, we're going to be closer to 2.4. Across the world, we need to translate our warm words into action. Next slide, please. And in the UK, we have been turning words into action. The Transport Decarbonisation Plan and more recent net zero strategy provide a clear action plan at the national level. And it provides a credible pathway for getting to net zero across the different transport sectors. It provides an overarching framework, but a huge amount is needed to turn this into reality. A good starting point would be more transparency from the DFT in the assumptions that they used in generating this TDP pathway shown here, and how it reflects uncertainties with issues such as accelerating EVs and modal shift. And of course, we all know the massive challenges in decarbonising goods traffic, maritime and aviation, and the big decisions that will lie ahead on powertrain technologies. But I wanted to focus today on how we can make transport decarbonisation real in the different parts of the UK. The DFT highlighted place-led leadership as one of the key themes and promised that a toolkit would be forthcoming. But local authorities, communities and businesses are hungry to act now. So what should we be doing? Next slide, please. So this diagram here shows that we can all follow a simple process to develop a credible and deliverable decarbonisation strategy to meet the needs of different places. First, we need to benchmark our emissions, how much is being generated, by what types of trip, and how this might change in the future. And then we need to understand the pathway to net zero. How quickly do we need to reduce our emissions? And then from that, understanding the gap between where we're likely to be and where we should be. Secondly, at the bottom left here, we need a credible route map to get to the pathway. It needs to capture all of the components to decarbonise the system. And of course, these components are highly place specific. The solutions in rural areas are very different to large conurbations. That's why we have our speakers today representing diverse areas who will give us different insights. Thirdly, we need to mobilise and deliver programmes that will be impactful and operating at scale. Sure, there's a place for pilots, but we must influence large numbers of people, significantly influence their behaviours and choices, and deliver at speed. And we need to evaluate the impacts of our programmes and apply course correction if we're off track. Let's look at some of the specifics on the next slide, please. So first of all, looking at benchmarking, we need insights into our current emissions and how they might change under a future business as usual. It's relatively easy to build a spreadsheet-based transport carbon model where you can explore different futures. You need a local transport model and then standard carbon emission factors that can be applied. This graph shows forecast changes in emissions between 2020 and 2050 in one area where we've recently worked. It shows that the 2030 ICE car sales ban delivers rapid overall reductions in the 2030s. The graph was produced before this week's announcement on HGVs between 2035 and 2040, and therefore this will help to squeeze the orange block on HGVs in later years. You can then use the model to build deep insights into current and future emissions. Use it to understand the contributions of different journey purposes, trip lengths and movements. And then from that, you can identify the critical markets that need to be targeted in your work. But we do also need to navigate the inherent uncertainties that lie ahead. How travel might change in response to national and local economic drivers and levelling up. How quickly will people adopt EVs over the next decade? And critically, the rate of decarbonisation of the grid. There's no point driving EVs if they're powered by dirty electricity. We then need to question if the business as usual is going to deliver the speed of change that's needed. Next slide, please. We need to understand the future carbon pathway for the area. Many areas have already developed their pathways based on understanding their total carbon budget. This graph on the left shows the pathway for Surrey as an example. The orange line shows the overall pathway and the blue line shows the specific transport pathway because transport is harder to decarbonise. The graph to the right shows that the carbon pathway is shaped by the remaining budget. The lower the remaining budget, the steeper the curve. Most areas only have 6 or 7 years left, meaning that we need this steep reduction to 2030. We can then compare with the future business as usual, shown by the green line. But even with the 2030 ICE sales ban, we can see that we're a long way from where we need to be. And the red block shows the excess carbon generated. Under the business as usual, we blow that budget. The red arrow shows the maximum gap. In this case, we need to reduce emissions by around 15% over and above the business as usual by 2030 to hit the pathway. What we then need to do is to understand what's causing this gap. Many areas have particularly high volumes of freight traffic, and many areas have lots of trips, more than 10 miles, which of course could be challenging to shift from the car. Next slide, please. I'm also conscious that my screen might have frozen, so you've caught me in mid-flow. But this next slide shows that once you've understood what's driving the gap, you can then start to scope your options. First, consider a top-down approach and different options for allocating the difference between the 5 themes that are shown here. A behaviour-led approach would have a much greater focus on reducing, shortening, and shifting trips. A technology-led approach would have a much greater focus on accelerating electrification of the vehicle fleet. And then you can take a bottom-up approach. Consider all of the potential policy options at your disposal. Don't be afraid to test the boundaries. What's the scope for digital to replace trips and for spatial planning to help people to make shorter journeys? And be ambitious with your plans for cycling, not just going Dutch, but widespread rollout of e-bikes. Aim beyond short-term recovery of the bus market, plan for medium-term growth. And freight and deliveries are an increasing concern. Consider options for consolidation. And we need to be much more proactive in managing demand, not just parking management, but also considering charging schemes. And we need to rethink about how people are going to use cars in the future. EVs are expensive to buy, but cheap to run. How do we avoid a massive rebound effect in EV traffic? So we're going to need to consider new models for access to electric cars. And then from this approach, looking at the top down and the bottom up, we can then start to build our own local balanced pathways, balancing the bottom up and the top down to develop the best approach for our own areas. Next slide, please. So we then need to effectively engage and make the case for the new approach. This might be through a new LTP or a rapid refresh, but it needs to be quick. We don't have time to get stuck in years of plan making. It also needs to be much more wide-ranging than in the past. It needs to capture the role of digital in helping to reduce the need to travel, and spatial planning in improving accessibility and shortening people's journeys. But we first need to ensure that we have a clear logic and narrative. Identify how you'll deliver the transformed conditions for walking and cycling and improved access by public transport. Use tools such as the PCT to explore how you'll deliver transformative change to active travel, drawing on and expanding from your LC WIPs. And then use analytical tools to understand the extent to which we can change travel behaviours. If you don't have a transport model, use rapid reckoners such as elasticity-based approaches, and work through your networks to learn lessons from other peer authorities on the modal shift that can be delivered. Delivering meaningful behaviour change is going to be pivotal to the benefits of your programme. Improving non-car accessibility and modal shift will be critical to delivering wider benefits and a stronger case for change. Make sure that you include road safety, air quality, and improved quality of place in the case that you're making. and a just transition will be critical. So you must identify how measures could impact on different places and different groups of people. And use this evidence to develop a coherent narrative on the benefits before engaging with leaders and citizens. We need honest conversations as we engage. We need to clearly explain why we need the change, translating frustrations about the global pace to the need for us to take local action. We also need to test boundaries. How far are our leaders prepared to go? They'll get very excited about carrots, but fearful of sticks. We know that government has effectively delegated the demand management question to local government, but we have to explore this with our eyes open on the potential consequences and benefits. We should also consider forums like citizens' panels. We need to get an accurate representation of people's opinions, not just those who shout loudest. So please ensure that you talk to representative samples of people, including those likely to be most affected, and explore how we could help them to make the changes in their lifestyles so that we can deliver that just transition. Through this, you should be able to create a compelling case, create a compelling business case for your program with a clear case of change and wide-ranging co-benefits for your area. Could I have the next slide, please? You then need to deliver change on the ground through your reshaped investment programs. First, coordinate your programs so that you're clear on your synergies and the dependencies. Take a whole corridor approach so that you can optimize benefits between different users. You're going to need to prioritize. You can't have everything on the ground simultaneously. Make sure that you prioritize schemes that can deliver the largest impacts, and remember that we need to be delivering large reductions at speed, but also make sure that you pay attention to no regrets actions. And continue engaging. You'll need local support for what you're trying to achieve, but don't give in to the noisy mob. Too many road space reallocation schemes are being removed following pressure from the motoring lobby. Clearly explain the benefits and secure support from community groups and local people who'll benefit from quieter and safer streets. And then get delivering at speed. Remember, we need large-scale programs to be delivered over the next 5 years, and we need to support rapid transition towards EVs and manage reductions in travel demand before 2030. And you must evaluate how you're progressing, not just in 5 years with the next LTP, but annually. How well are you progressing with increasing active travel and bus use? How many people are adopting EVs? And how is this translating into travel demand? You need to be able to take rapid course correction if needed, or continue to build on your great work in driving positive change for your area. So next slide, please. So from our working with local authorities across the country, we think there's 7 critical principles that need to be addressed. We can't underestimate the scale of the challenge that's faced, and speed is critical. We need to deliver substantial impacts before 2030. This is going to mean comprehensive action is needed. We need to use the avoid, shift, and improve framework to deliver fundamental change. And this is going to mean addressing all modes, not just electric vehicles. It means sorting our buses out and getting people onto active travel. We also need to avoid locking into high carbon pathways. It means carefully considering new road investment. Is it really needed unless it can be clearly shown to unlock lower carbon choices? We need to get serious about embodied emissions from new infrastructure, and not just roads. It could also include large-scale public transport schemes if they don't rapidly pay back with large-scale modal shift. And fundamentally, this is going to mean effective coordination between us all. So just the final slide, please. Hopefully, I've shown in my brief presentation this morning that it's going to be time to deliver. Thank you very much. And apologies also that the screen froze midway. I can assure you I've been speaking while, obviously while I've been frozen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much. And I think my favourite quote of the day so far, it's definitely tweetable, is "Time's up for blah, blah, blah." But I think that says it all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And A brilliant introduction and overview to solutions there. Can we move on? Thank you. I was going to say move on to the next slide. So now I'm going to hand over to James Golding-Graham, who's going to give us a perspective from England's economic heartland, which I think is really important for us all to hear. Thank you, James.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Caroline, and again, thank you to Atkins for the opportunity to come along and have a chat with you all today. My name's James. I'm the Decarbonisation and Innovation Manager for England's Economic Heartland. Next slide, please. We are one of the 7 subnational transport bodies which cover England outside of London. So STBs, it's important to mention, because quite often people aren't entirely sure of what we do, support the government in terms of prioritising investment into infrastructure that improves connectivity across the regions, as well as providing additional support and thought leadership, working with our constituent local authority partners. EEH has a membership of local transport authorities and LEPs, which stretches from Swindon down in the south to Cambridgeshire in the east, and from Northamptonshire to Peterborough and down to Hertfordshire. We are home to several fantastic innovation clusters, some great historic sites, AONBs, but we have some really significant challenges in terms of connectivity. These are particularly brought into sharp focus when we're looking at our transport emissions. Next slide, please. We should and could be doing better. If we look back to 2005 and take an average over those last 15 years, we've consistently seen that our region per capita transport emissions from surface transport particularly are around 30% higher than the UK average. There's been almost no reductions in emissions from transport, despite our cars and vans getting more efficient. They've also got a lot bigger and heavier, and we have an awful lot more of them. EEH isn't particularly unusual in that respect. This is replicated across most areas of the UK. Our region is predominantly rural and peri-urban in terms of the makeup, and though we've got some large towns and cities, our population is quite dispersed. Our east-west connectivity is poor, and our cross-boundary public transport networks aren't particularly well funded, or across the region as a whole, particularly well used. If we add these things together, many people feel they don't have a viable option other than to get into their car for almost every trip they're making. For many living here, there's no reasonable low carbon alternatives in place at the moment. We're also quite a wealthy region on the whole, and that means that most of our households have access to at least one car, and many have 2 or more. We find that once that investment's made, it's quite difficult for people not to simply jump into the car when it's considered convenient and perceived as relatively cheap. This means we've got significant issues with congestion and some frankly shameful journey times between our strategically important places. This is all in the context of nationally significant levels of housing and population growth. There are more than 450,000 homes in planning in the region. And if we follow our ONS projections, that exceeds 800,000 by 2050. The final challenge, which is a good one, I think, is that our Leaders Forum has an aspirational 2040 net zero target for our transport system. Next slide, please. So what do we do? What do we do as a region and as a country? It's clear that there's a step change in approach is required, and we can't just be business as usual. We know that this scale of change is really challenging and to be honest, for some people quite scary. What we need to do though, or what we need to see, I say, is some really bold and inspiring leadership. What's happening is that this genuinely seems to be what the public wants to see. The responses to our consultation on transport strategy highlighted a desire for us to be bold, and that's really reflected, I think, in opinion polls that are taken across all areas in the UK at the moment. We also know that our businesses really crave stability and certainty. They want clarity and they want clear targets to be set. So what are we doing in our region to help that happen? Next slide, please. As Jonathan very clearly articulated, before you can fix a problem, you've got to know what it is. So we're in the process of developing a carbon baseline. This is obviously similar to, as I say, Jonathan has already explained this. We've got to understand where emissions are occurring, which modes are contributing what, where journeys are starting and finishing, and what sort of reductions we'll need to deliver in each part of our region to meet those legally binding net zero targets. So we commission work that looks to take the emerging nationally kind of recognised trajectories, which is developed by the CCC in their 6th carbon budget, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, the Tyndall Centre, and apply them to both our regional area and our local authorities. And you can see from this graph that the trajectories are quite different. This top pink line shows a pre-COP, pre-net zero trajectory, business as usual, if you like, and we're kind of on that trajectory now. So this shows if we do absolutely nothing, this is what's going to happen to carbon in our region. And again, that's pretty consistent with what's happening in the UK as well. The blue line shows the CCC's road and rail net balance net zero as set out in their 6th carbon budget. The brown line is an extrapolation of the slightly vague pathways as shown in the DfT's Transport Decarbonisation Plan, again reflecting something that Jonathan's already said. We've yet to see the data tables that sit behind that. The dotted line shows what the CCC's pathway would look like if we really wanted to get to net zero by 2040. So that's a really accelerated pathway in line with what our regional leadership would like us to deliver. And finally, the yellow line is the science-led pathway as developed by the Tyndall Centre with a focus on keeping the rising temperature below about 1.5 degrees. Incidentally, when the UK went into lockdown last year, we rather obviously perhaps saw a really significant drop in surface transport emissions. That drop really quite closely matched that Tyndall Centre trajectory, so it gives you some idea of the scale of change that we need to see. Clearly, looking at the remaining emissions, what's under the line, we can see that the quicker we cut carbon, the less of it that gets cumulatively emitted. I'd say that this really demonstrates clearly that the arbitrary dates set at some distance in the future aren't perhaps the best way to cut emissions quickly and limit the damage to the Earth's climate. That's really just an aside, I think. Once we understand what we need to be doing, what our trajectory looks like, the next part of the puzzle is to develop an understanding of the sort of interventions we need to make to deliver the decarbonisation needed. For me, though, this is quite a positive process. Many of the things that we're going to need to do to cut carbon will quite dramatically improve our places. We'll get better air quality through planning, we'll get better access to jobs, shops, schools, services, and not to mention better quality, more reliable public transport and cycling and walking infrastructure. All of those things are going to be needed. Next slide, please. The measures that can be taken to deliver these reductions are quite well established. We've all, certainly all the speakers on this call have been talking about them for quite a long time now. I'd imagine most of you who are dialed in are quite familiar with this diagram. Again, I think it's already been previously mentioned. There's quite a long list of interventions under each of these headings, many of which will require some central government policy action, but there's still an awful lot there for local government to get our teeth into in terms of place-based decarb. I'd say England's economic heartland and the wider subnational transport bodies are really well placed to support this sort of user-centric place-based approach to decarbonisation, because as regional bodies, we're really embedded in our places. We recognise the inherent differences in the region should be celebrated and championed. So we're working with government to facilitate this and accommodate the differences, the physical, political and social, and make sure that the best outcomes are achieved. So this is fundamentally that the right interventions are made in the right places. For me, what's really interesting is understanding how these different interventions can reduce carbon in different places. And that's particularly a key area of focus for the STBs, which we think will be really important for our partners to understand going forward. I'll finish this slide by saying there's a massive amount of change that's going to need to happen to achieve net zero, but reflecting back on that slide, we shouldn't fear it. It's really going to help us to end up with better places. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, we know what the government want local authorities to deliver. The TDP sets this out quite explicitly, so that we know what the DfT are expecting. I think, though, it's worthwhile just pausing and making sure, or asking the question, that if local authorities have the right tool at their disposal. We know there's going to be some consultation on LTP guidance in the new year. That's going to be really important in terms of decarbonisation and how, as local authorities go about setting out their ambitions and approaches to delivery. There are some really big asks in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, and I think it's also important that we make sure that the right bits of government are intervening in the right place. So I'm going to set out a few points that I think might be key to delivering net zero in transport. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So to start with, we need clarity on governance. Governance isn't particularly a sexy thing, but there's a real need to clearly demarcate where emissions should be accounted for and by whom. The majority of emissions from cars and vans comes from medium and longer trips that often start in one local authority area and cross several others before finishing another. There's absolutely no clarity at the moment on how to address the emissions from such journeys. Until that's addressed, it's going to be really difficult to set appropriate spatial carbon budgets and targets, which I think will be required to drive for meaningful action at a local level. Any targets and budgets that are set need not to be explicit in regard to how they're delivered. We need local leadership to be empowered to work with civic and business partners to flexibly deploy solutions at appropriate scale, really adopting and kind of buying into that outcome-based approach. To deliver and enable that, there's a need for genuine commitment to devolution. In the context of transport, this means a commitment to devolve greater responsibility to a combination of mayoral combined authorities and local authorities, with support from us as subnational transport bodies on how best to respond to any of these new responsibilities. We must move away from silos in government at all levels, particularly if we're talking about a place-based approach. There's a need for government to break down the funding both within and between departments such as DfT, DCMS and Treasury. If that isn't prioritised, it's difficult to be consistent when, again, taking that place-based approach to decarbonisation. At a regional level, there's a need for us to evolve from developing pure transport strategies to thinking about connectivity strategies. A number of the STBs are moving to this approach already. It's a really natural progression, I think. So when looking at how to affect change in the transport system, we've got to consider digital and energy almost as equal partners in this. Our local authorities are facing significant pressure on finances. I have to say this almost every time I speak. They're making really tough choices every day. An authority close to where I live has more than a £45 million budget shortfall. To some extent that's to do with pandemic response, but in the main it's simply through meeting these ever-growing costs of adult and social care. And if there's no explicit mandate to address decarbonisation and appropriate budgets supplied to local authorities, which includes revenue, then other areas are they'll simply be prioritised because they're more immediate. Only government can have the conversation about the way in which we raise the funding for investment in transport infrastructure, transport decarbonisation, and the way that users pay to access our services and infrastructure. The way we pay for transport in the UK is fundamentally broken. There's a need to review the business model, I think, for road-based services, bus service and rail services as a matter of some urgency. I think with GBR emerging, there's an opportunity to reset the pricing signals that government wants to send. If we're serious about mode shift and decarbonisation and want to encourage more public transport and active travel, then government needs to seize the moment and change the relative costs of transportation, probably through taxation. Difficult conversation that might be, but we know that Treasury is already facing a £40 billion deficit from the loss of EED and fuel duty as EVs come online in more significant numbers. Next slide, please. So as a final slide, in terms of what we need to do to accelerate delivery, I don't think there's a single magic bullet for it. It's really a case of all of the above yesterday if possible. which doesn't make for a particularly exciting answer, but I think that's probably the reality of it. To deliver transport decarbonisation, the pace and scale required, we need government to set out a framework for rapid action. This is an emergency after all. The Transport Decarbonisation Plan should be lauded and welcomed. It's a really good starting point, but we now need this acceleration of delivery and a strategy that around that acceleration, particularly with the funding in place to get the tanker turned and delivery of these policies underway, particularly at a local level. Finally, I've not really mentioned people much today or behaviour change. That's because it's largely absent from the DFT's plan. It's kind of there if you read between the lines, but it's very much implicit. It's never explicit. For me, that's a big challenge. There's a grand canyon of a gap emerging between what people know they should do and what they're actually doing. If I reluctantly shine a light on myself here, I know I shouldn't fly, and by and large, I don't. But come next summer, I'll probably get on a plane because I'd really like my kid to be able to go swimming in the warm seas of the Mediterranean instead of freezing in the North Sea. And if I dug my heels in, my partner would simply go without me. There's no affordable or practical alternative to flying, and we know that it's being worked on, but this is about behaviour more than anything else. I've got 2 cars because we live in a village and it makes life convenient. Again, there's very little in the way of alternatives. I do take the train and public transport wherever I can, but it's demonstrably more expensive. I'm therefore still not making the decisions I know to be the right one, and this is literally my job. I recognise it's the hypocrisy in this, but it's also the fact that other than the moral driver, there's very little incentive to change. So without a big nationally led conversation about the changes we need to make, what happens if we don't, and how will we support to make them, we simply won't see the kind of behaviour change that needs to happen within the next 10 years occurring. The impacts of the technology changes will come too late. Even if we meet EV targets, we'll be falling short of carbon targets. If we don't have people with us, then there's little chance of optimising the opportunities and benefits that the transition to net zero can bring, or indeed hitting targets. I think that's the last point I'll make today, probably the most important one. So I'll wrap it up there, and I look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much, and thank you for your honesty and your confessional at the end. I think you raised some really, really important points, which I hope we'll get into more detail into a discussion on. I think you raised a fantastic point in terms of the canon between what we are doing and what we need to be doing, and I think that's vast. And we're all looking for the answer in terms of how we can close that gap. So hopefully we'll get more into that, but I will now hand over to Louisa Stemford-Hayward, who is from Gloucestershire County Council. So we're really looking forward to hearing more of the rural view. I think the really important thing about this webinar is that we're hearing from people all around the country, from different parts of the country where things are different. Things are different transport-wise, so it's really important to hear from those different perspectives. So I'll hand over to Louisa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Caroline, for that introduction. I'm, as you said, here to bring the perspective of a largely rural county. And in Gloucestershire, about 30% of the population live in rural areas. I'd like to talk about why rural areas need to be considered more when we're talking about decarbonising transport. And I'll speak about Gloucestershire's recent local transport plan review and our local emission targets. I'd also like to share some examples of what we're doing in Gloucestershire and why community-based local solutions are so important when we're developing decarbonisation strategies. So on my first slide, I'm trying to emphasize the point why it is so important to talk about rural areas. And that's because the rural areas are the biggest emitters of transport-related CO2 emissions outside metropolitan areas. The biggest emitters are outside metropolitan areas, so rural areas emit the most CO2 overall. And the reason for that is primarily that rural areas have the longest trips and therefore also the largest emissions per trip. And that is a big problem because these journeys are also typically harder to shift to sustainable modes of transport, which are less available in rural areas. And on this slide, you can see a map of Gloucestershire, and I used the recently released place-based carbon calculator created by the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, and it clearly shows that the more rural the area, the higher the per capita car-based transport emissions are. And overall, an analysis of census data shows that in rural area, you have a very high car dependency, but also substantially higher levels of home working and more walking trips in some areas, at least, than you would expect. And that's something I'd like to come back at later slides. On my next slide, I've chosen a graph from our local transport plan consultation. We've recently reviewed our local transport plan. And during the consultation, it became clear that climate change was a major concern amongst the people who responded. And I'm showing this because even in a largely rural county like Gloucestershire, 17% of households do not own a private car. And for those with a vehicle, not everybody in the household has obviously access to that car all the time. So in our consultation, we found that people want sustainable travel choices to encourage a reduction in carbon emissions. And we also found that people are most concerned about a lack of travel choice resulting in car dependency and social isolation. And while obviously these findings are not statistically robust, they do indicate that it is possible to win support for the dramatic changes that will be needed if we're serious about decarbonising transport in rural areas. On the next slide, I'm showing our Gloucestershire carbon targets. So, like in the rest of the world, climate change is increasingly seen as a major priority in Gloucestershire. And in 2019, Gloucestershire declared a climate emergency and committed to the following targets, which is that all CO2 emissions are to be net zero by 2050, and that target was later brought forward to 2045, which is also the target that we're using in our local transport plan. In addition, we've committed to an 80% reduction in emissions by 2030, which is relative to a 2005 base level. These are ambitious targets, and as you can see on the graph on the slide, you can see the Gloucestershire target in dark green, that's the dark green line, a linear pathway to net zero by 2050 as a light green dotted line, and a balanced pathway to net zero, which was developed by the Climate Change Committee in December 2020 as the light green dashed line. We also have the blue line, which shows an even more ambitious decarbonisation pathway, which considers Gloucestershire's remaining CO2 budget. The graph clearly indicates the rapid and significant reductions in carbon emissions that are needed across all sectors, including transport. So what needs to be done? If we could have the next slide, please. We need to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles, and that is particularly important in rural areas because mode shift is so much more difficult. In addition, electric vehicles have a greater potential for carbon savings in rural areas because of the longer average trips. Vehicle range has significantly increased in recent years and is no longer the main concern. And at the same time, charging at home may be more easily available in rural areas, at least in part, because there's more available space. However, as you can see on the map that I'm showing on this slide, Gloucestershire has a much higher electric vehicle charging point density in the urban areas than in the more rural surroundings. Another major barrier is the relatively high cost of electric vehicles, particularly in buying them. So we need to explore sharing models such as car clubs. Gloucestershire has published an ultra-low emission vehicle strategy last year. and started to accelerate the installation of electric vehicle charging points in Gloucestershire. However, electric vehicles are not carbon-free overall, and concerns are rising about particulate emissions from tyre and brake wear. And this is on top of the fact that even if we have an accelerated uptake, we're still many years away from an all-electric vehicle fleet. So focusing on electric vehicles alone is therefore not enough. On the next slide, I'd like to talk about active travel. So the COVID-19 crisis has shown us the extent to which a shift to walking and cycling is possible. And there is research that suggests that the mode with the highest capability to reduce car-based carbon emissions is the e-bike. And that's particularly true in rural areas with less public transport alternatives and where trips are longer and may therefore be less suitable to conventional cycling. And most parts of Gloucestershire, for example, are quite hilly. And again, an e-bike could make the difference between being able to cycle a certain trip or not. That means that we'll have to create networks of safe routes to link places. And that's why we're developing LSWIPs, not only in our urban centres of Cheltenham and Gloucester, but also in market towns such as Stroud and Tewkesbury, and we will roll this out further. The map shows our Gloucestershire Cycle Desire lines, and we are planning to develop these into a Gloucestershire-wide plan that links places and market town LSWIPs. We have already started to implement this ambition by securing in excess of £10 million to deliver the first section of a Gloucestershire cycle spine that will eventually link the north of Cheltenham to Stroud via Gloucester. On the next slide, I'd like to talk about public transport challenges, because we know that long distance commuter trips account for the bulk of CO2 emissions, and for these trips the train is the ideal alternative to the car, with buses suitable for medium distance journeys. And obviously in rural areas the general public transport network is quite thin. Across the UK, bus services have been declining in recent years, and COVID-19 made that much worse. Public transport in rural areas is often heavily reliant on subsidies. However, as outlined earlier when I spoke about the LTP consultation feedback, there are significant unmet transport needs across Gloucestershire. We need to start seeing public transport as an essential and necessary service for all and fundamental to decarbonising transport. We've just launched our Total Transport project, and we've been successful in our bid for the Rural Mobility Fund. So we will implement a demand-responsive transport service in 2 pilot areas in Gloucestershire. One of them is shown on this slide. The demand-responsive transport service will feed into high-frequency bus services, making them more viable, hopefully. But most importantly, it will address a key transport problem in rural areas, and that is to find a solution for the first mile. So the first mile is often the most expensive in rural areas. People who don't have access to a car may have to take a taxi to access a train station or key bus routes, or they go in the car if they can, and then just complete the whole journey by car. So demand-responsive transport services are also evolving fast. And there are more and more integrated journey planners and booking systems and software that calculates the best route options. So I do hope that this will be, will help us to address this first mile problem in rural areas. And that is linked to the next slide, because if we want to convince people to use alternatives to the private car, we need to provide an integrated offer of public transport and demand-responsive and active travel forms of transport. Gloucestershire's local transport plan proposes to implement transport interchange hubs at train stations and strategic bus stops, and that would offer secure and comfortable waiting facilities, secure bike parking, which is especially important for e-bikes, delivery pickups. Mobility hubs can also provide access to car clubs or e-cycle hire and other mobility services. They can also be combined with providing other facilities and services, and reduce the need to travel to urban centres overall. The idea of developing transport interchange hubs was very popular during the LTP consultation, which showed the potential for community involvement in the design of rural mobility solutions and points of interchange. And it provides opportunities for parish councils to get involved at a local level. So on my next slide, I've put another map of Gloucestershire, because I would like to point out that perhaps surprisingly, some rural areas show a very high mode share for walking trips in specific areas. An example for that is in Gloucestershire is the Cotswolds, and that clearly indicates that the principles of 20-minute neighbourhoods, for example, can also be applied and are working in some rural settings, though I think we need to do a lot more research on finding out exactly what these places are doing right. So in addition, 23% of Gloucestershire's working population worked from home in April 2020, and that's up from 12% in 2019, obviously related to the lockdown. But the 2020 figure has a wide range across Gloucestershire. So in the Forest of Dean, we had 17% home working, and then the Cotswolds 33%. And that shows the potential for home working and associated trip reductions, especially in rural areas. And Gloucestershire County Council is supporting this by rolling out Fastershire, which is a better broadband connection. The combination of potential for home working with the fact that cycling and walking levels vary greatly between comparable places in rural areas highlights the potential to look at villages and market towns that perform well and use them as examples, and to apply the findings to other areas and maybe new settlements. So on my last slide, I would just like to summarize that decarbonising transport in rural areas is important because it addresses the most polluting journeys. It is therefore essential to accelerate the rollout of electric vehicles in rural areas. And e-bikes offer a great potential for mode shift to active travel modes. And public transport needs to offer an integrated service that considers the first mile. In addition, public transport in rural areas provides an important social support service and cannot be viewed simply in terms of commercial viability. However, rural areas are often at a disadvantage because the lower population densities make transport provision less commercially attractive. And we therefore need funding opportunities, especially targeted at rural areas. We also need to build on existing potential in many areas that shows that sustainable places can be created in rural areas, and it's therefore important that solutions are localized and community focused. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louisa. Thank you so much. And I was really delighted to hear you talking about the role of cycling. We all know that our sedentary lifestyles are killing us, so walking and cycling have to be a bigger part of our lifestyles if we're going to be healthy and we're going to improve our well-being as well as reduce carbon emissions. And it was really interesting, and I was happy to hear the emphasis on public transport as well, especially the demand responsive transport service pilot that Louisa was talking about in Gloucestershire. And I would love it's not my position to be able to invite Louisa back next year to talk about how the pilot went, but it's a suggestion for the organisers of this webinar, because I personally would love to hear how that pilot goes. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So now we're going to hear from Alex Greatholder. He's going to be talking about Transport for West Midlands and giving us the perspective from the West Midlands, which I'm looking forward to hearing. Thank you, Alex.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Caroline. Yeah, so good morning. I guess we'll sort of kick straight into it. So if we sort of switch forward to the next slide. So just to give you a bit of context, Transport for West Midlands, we're the transport arm of what's called West Midlands Combined Authority, which is the local transport authority for the metropolitan area. So one of our key responsibilities, like Gloucestershire Council and like the unitary authorities, is producing a local transport plan for the region. And we recently, we're currently reviewing that local transport plan. We've recently published a green paper about that called Reimagining Transport in the West Midlands, which you can see the link's just been shared in the chat, which is great. I encourage people to look at that if you want to know more about what we're doing there. And what we're trying to do really is, so up on the screen here, you can kind of see these new policy agendas on the left. So in terms of you know, thinking about how an LTP might be different. We're trying to take into account some of these big changes that have happened. So that includes things like our inclusive growth framework, which is really is kind of mirroring government's levelling up agenda, just that realization that people are starting to question kind of the economic model and wanting to ensure it's more inclusive. So that's been really important. Obviously, the climate emergency, which we're talking about today, is really critical, but also the past couple of years, the pandemic, what that has taught us about in terms of people's changing priorities, reflecting on the adaptability of our, of society, of our economy, but also some of the challenges ahead that many of you be aware about in terms of the viability of public transport right now, with demand being low. And then finally, the local industrial strategy and making sure that transport is integrated into what we're trying to achieve as an economy. So the way in which we've interpreted these various policy drivers is through the creation of these 5 motors for change on the right here, which are really trying to pick out where the relationship between transport and our society, our economy, needs to be improved in order to deliver that more inclusive approach to growth. And that's really key for making sure that decarbonisation, we can deliver that in a way that is equitable and includes a just transition, is ensuring actually fundamentally our transport plans need to be addressing not just decarbonisation but a broad range of objectives. So quickly kind of moving on then. Many of the elements of the story that you'll be able to sort of read in that green paper are not all that different from where we've been before. Even within, just looking at the decarbonisation agenda locally, but also nationally, there's widespread acknowledgement that the tech fix, the shift to ULEVs is critical, but it's not going to be sufficient. And so we fundamentally, as part of our strategy, need to think about how we change behaviours, how we move away from passenger transport, from the use of cars, which is people feel is controversial. Some people sort of tiptoe around that. But actually, when we've gone out and asked the public about that kind of issue, it's something that they understand. The need to move away from car use is accepted in the same way that everyone knows. We should be eating healthily and exercising. These are things that we know we want to do, we want to get towards, but they're easier said than done. And using some of the concepts here, we've been able to frame the ways of achieving a better balance between the need to provide access and the impacts of transport using these kind of old and new frameworks. So I won't go into avoid, shift, improve. My colleagues have covered that already. But also kind of on the right here, there's kind of two fundamental primary paths you're looking at for the options of travelling that are better than cars. So can we get more people on fewer vehicles? That's the public transport route. Or perhaps we can move towards lower impact, less energy intensive vehicles. So with micromobility at the moment being a bit of a it's not fundamentally new technology, for that's been around, but it seems to be deployed and being given a bit more serious thought. But actually, taking a step back from transport, one of the key concepts that we're looking at is actually to transport and economy are absolutely fundamentally linked, and transport needs to underpin your economy. But actually, the success of your economy, of society, is really about access. And transport is just one thing that feeds into that. So it's really important to think about not just transport and the way that we travel, but how that interrelates and interacts with the way that we're using land, and also the way that we can access people and places through the use of digital technology. So put all that stuff together, and actually it's quite empowering in a way, because there's all kinds of pathways and options that might help us deliver a more equitable form of growth through changing the transport system, and that's that's why we've called our green paper Reimagining Transport in the West Midlands. If we move on, but as I've said, kind of some of this isn't exactly new, fundamentally new. We've kind of this is very much kind of the continuation of a decades-old story in terms of knowing that these are the kind of things that we should be doing. And it seems that we keep getting stuck at an impasse. So we know what kind of world we want to live in, but where we struggle is implementing the measures that make that happen. And kind of cutting to the awkward chase, we've acknowledged before that we can't build our way out of these problems, and there's only so far you can realistically get without measures that restrain the choices that we're trying to move away from. And when we talk to the public, not just us, but also the Climate Assembly, there is growing recognition of this. It's kind of understood by the public that such measures are probably needed. But without a sense that there's kind of a critical level of consensus, meaning that these measures are going to be challenging to progress. There's a lot of political risk in trying to progress these things. That story is playing out again around the climate emergency. So the LGA, Local Government Association, has, and other groups have been saying things like, nudges aren't enough and we need greater political bravery. And there is a little bit of tiptoeing around these things. And as James sort of said earlier as well, even the TDP acknowledging we need behaviour change that has to be a part of what we do. And it kind of hints that this won't all be easy policy making. But what's being danced around here is that need for demand management and restraint. So it's parking, it might include parking policy, reallocation of space, so reducing space on the roads for general traffic, it might include pricing and things like that. The TDP itself is very much looking into local authorities to make progress on this through local transport planning and place-led leadership. And what's more, DfT expects and the government expects that in setting out how we're going to deal with that, we should be showing how our plans deliver quantifiable carbon reductions. And kind of word on the street is, if we're not doing that, we might expect that some of the funding streams might not be available to us. So actually, this might be a condition of continued investment in our transport system, is that we're showing that we're delivering against that. But it's not easy. We've been here before. These are politically risky measures to implement. I think it's interesting that the CCC has the Commission of Climate Change has looked at the TDP and the net zero strategy, and it said it's great, we've got that ambition there for behaviour change, but more detail needed in terms of the actions that sit behind this. So I think we can make progress at the local level, but it requires a lot more consensus, cross-party consensus in order to achieve that, but also a sense of shared political risk between the national and local level. There kind of needs to be a sense of we're all in this together if we're gonna make some progress. Moving on, so as I say, we kind of we've been here before on different issues. So how does the climate emergency change things? And sort of people have talked about. You've seen graphs like this today, and you'll have seen them before about these different trajectories of where we want to be in terms of decarbonising. But actually, the real thing that we need to focus on is not on what our net zero date is in 20 or 30 years. It's what we're going to do in the next 10 years, because that's where some of the real legwork needs to be done in decarbonising transport, and that requires a very different approach. Local transport plans have tended to focus on the very long term, and and how you might gradually get towards that. But actually, the challenge really is in what we can start doing now to affect change, and that's going to require a focus on doing more with what we have currently in terms of infrastructure and technologies. So the quote here on Jamie Lone is really pertinent, I guess, interpreting what that might mean. So, this is almost the opposite of how local transport plans have looked at this in the past in many senses. But if you want sustainability, actually, the answer might not be more money at all. Okay, so in terms of, if we just move on, in terms of how equity fits into this, I sort of mentioned those 5 motives for change before, and I think actually it's not that difficult to build that narrative and that understanding around how this end state of a more sustainable transport system in which people are traveling less by cars and more by biking and living locally and all the rest of it. There's all sorts of ways in which that delivers more equitable benefits in terms of nicer streets, less air quality, healthier lives, reducing the inequity in access between those who do or don't have cars. That's kind of all in there, and that's is okay, but that's not really where our problem is. So I think moving on, I think what we've learned from developing the LTP is, whilst you can create that narrative, there's a need for a little bit of realism and kind of stepping back on some of this stuff. So it's quite easy to get caught into a trap of kind of utopian thinking on some of this. So we aren't going to eradicate inequity in our transport plan. We might move to what's a relatively better state, but it is important to think about the future and in your strategy, what is happening to inequity? How might it be morphing? So the 20-minute neighbourhood's a really good way of thinking about that. So there's been a lot of focus on 20-minute neighbourhoods, but some of the feedback that we've got from our citizens is, this is very nice if you live in a lovely area that might look like that picture on the right at the top, but actually lots of us don't live in these kinds of places and they're struggling to engage with it. And they're right now, mobility for some of those people who don't live in those areas in which perhaps more aspirational, mobility for them is a means to social mobility. They're trying to access better opportunities that might not be on their doorstep. So we need to think about, what are we saying around how the role of mobility in the future and how these places are transforming as well. And then the other kind of wicked problem with moving on to the next slide, the other wicked problem we kind of face is this issue of paralysis with equity in terms of, as I said, just the, in your end state, those who are perhaps most disadvantaged, if you're approaching a strategy from the perspective of wanting better equity, are going to be the ones with most to gain, but actually it's the transition that's the really hard part. And it's kind of those same people are likely to face the biggest barriers, the most difficulty in making those transitions in adapting. So we need to think about within the strategy, your strategy and your vision for place as well, how are we, what's the relative roles of citizens in that story in terms of who's the burden of, where the burden of kind of change is falling, and helping people who are most need to adapt as well. Moving through, so where we're at with our developing our LTP, really, because this is not the technical problem is not really an issue. We know the sorts of things that we need to do, the things that work and the things that don't work, and the consequences of those. The issue really is wrapping this up in a story that makes sense, and we are not. This is something that's going to require quite deep public engagement. I think that's going to be quite, the way our plan is working, it looks like it's shaping up at the moment, that's going to be quite different from in the past. So actually our plan is going to be relatively dynamic in terms of we're being honest about the kinds of things that we need to do right now, but also honest in terms of understanding that lack of endorsement there is now. So actually we kind of need to get the plan is one thing, and getting that out there, as Jonathan said, you can't hang around too long for publishing this plan. But actually, what's really important is that we begin this, the process of working through the public about when are we prepared to do, to start introducing some of those more difficult measures and what are the conditions to do that. So trying to develop a narrative in which people understand the link between their ambitions, where they might want to go, but what actions are needed to get there. Being honest about what's needed, but being empathetic around people not being quite ready. And the way we're exploring that at the moment as well is around looking at what different pathways might look like in the future, in terms of what if we stay on where we are, what are the issues that we're going to face, as well as what if we start changing course and moving towards a new future. So if we move on as well, there's not too much more to go. I wanted to dwell on this because other people have, and I think it's really critical in your story that it's not just one story for a whole region, that it's a story, at that kind of abstract region level. Actually, all of our areas have a really diverse range of places and communities, and your story needs to work and be developed in all of these places, and that is a real challenge. So the kind of what I've put up here tries to demonstrate a little bit of that in terms of, on the left you can see here, this is the second most popular commute mode in the West Midlands. So you can get a sense here that big orange area, that those are people who if you don't have a car, if you live in that area, you're most likely to travel by bus. Actually, so in those other areas around the Black Country, which is on the west, and Coventry on the east, public transport isn't the most popular thing after the car, it's walking. So these are places that are the setting, they're just intuitively, they're quite different places. That the kinds of solutions that might work in that orange area are not necessarily going to work in the others. And so really need to be tailoring things. The pictures on the right as well are all places that have been taken from within the West Midlands. Worth noting, whilst we have and all of us have a diversity of places, actually I'm sure there's others on the, there'll be people watching this who will see some of these places and think, actually I recognise, there's a place that's near me that looks just like this. We've all got places that look like this, and some of the opportunity I think there is in terms of understanding solutions to decarbonise and improve transport is through recognising that commonality of problems. Moving through, again, really critical in terms of developing our story is recognising that where we are now is very far from where we have been. So on the left, this explosion of mobility is what this is showing. So from the introduction of the cars, our lives have fundamentally changed. We travel way more than we ever used to. And we're not going to fit all of that travel. It's not as simple as saying, we'll take all of that travel, we'll put it on public transport. It's what has changed between then and now is much more, it's not just a change of how people travel, it's a change of how much people are traveling. And in that, we see that people are now traveling here, there and everywhere as well. And historically people used to stick within their town, they used to going between fewer places, and now actually travel's very, very dispersed, and that needs to be accounted for in whatever's going to work, because that level of mobility is so embedded, it's not just got a cultural importance, which it absolutely does. It is also important because of how our urban environment economy has been structured. So if we're going to very, very quickly change our transport system, we need to be thinking about better ways of being independently mobile without causing so many impacts for the use of cars. So this is where the things like micromobility are part of that conversation. I will finish on one last slide, which is just as well around how do we tell our story. So local transport plans tend to be, so they will tend to have a vision statement in there that will be quite motherhood and apple pie in terms of we want to be healthy and happy and great and fantastic and innovative, but actually that doesn't really help us articulate what that means to our citizens, and to help that debate around what are they prepared to accept, what do they endorse in terms of actions that we can take. So the other thing that we have been doing in terms of articulating what decarbonisation looks like is actually trying to explore that through visions of what places look like, and not just the low-hanging fruit that you'll often see pictures around Victorian terraces and city centres. Actually we've looked at what do we do in our modern suburbs where there's cul-de-sacs, and these are places that are designed around the car, and starting to reimagine them there, trying to bring citizens into that process as well, but also thinking about articulating this in terms of what does this mean for people who live in our area, how are they, what does this mean for their lifestyle change, how were they travelling before, whether they were shopping, taking kids to school, or going to work, and how might they be doing that in the future. So trying to articulate a vision that's not just about some warm kind of words, but actually means something in terms of people's relationships with transport and places. I will finish on that as well, and yeah, I don't think we've got time for this, so we'll leave it there, and perhaps talk about engagement in the panel.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you. It was really good to hear the perspective from the West Midlands, and I think one of the things that I really enjoyed or moved me was the reference to mobility as a route to social mobility. I think that's really key, and it makes us think that the challenges we face are not just about the future of the climate, but also about making sure that people have equal access to transport, because the I'm not finding the right words to articulate this very well, but the future of humanity is at stake here when it comes to reducing carbon emissions, but also we're looking at improving people's lives across the board to enable them to access jobs. And I think those maps that you showed where jobs accessible within 45 minutes, whether you had a car or didn't have a car, was really, really important and very visual and a really clear point to make. So thank you for that. We're now going to have a discussion. You listening, all those people listening have been putting lots of questions in the question box, so thank you so much, and it's been very thought-provoking, I'm sure, for all of us reading those questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time for all of them, but I'm going to jump in there right now to make sure we can get through as many as we can. Bear with me just 1 second. So I'm going to start with, bear with me while I pull up the questions. So the first question is actually going to be for Jonathan. Jonathan, with your experience with the Farnham Infrastructure Programme, how do we balance, sorry, I'm looking in the chat box, so people leave the chat box alone because it's jumping. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I've got the question.
You got it? Have you got it? So,
yeah, in terms of balancing, so in terms of recent work in Farnham, which is a town in Surrey, and I think it's perhaps one of the most challenging places in the country, actually, where in terms of thinking about decarbonisation strategy, the real issue there is that it's sort of characterised by hypermobility. Obviously, people are generally speaking, it's characterised by very high levels of income, very high proportion of households with at least 2 cars, and indeed one of the highest car mode shares in the country. And through the work we've been doing there, we have encountered some opposition to some of the proposals that we're looking to introduce. I think one of the challenges, though, when you're engaging, and I think I previously mentioned this, is that engagement quite frequently you do obviously get very vocal people who have particularly strong views. And I think one of the key things that you have to do is to sort of explain, how you as an individual are actually part of the problem, but also part of the solution. So many people in the town have real issues with the sheer amount of traffic that's going through the town, including the town centre. And that was the original rationale for the project. And but we were able to rapidly show that actually you as a citizen driving through the town are obviously contributing to the challenge. So how do we actually engage with people in terms of thinking about how they can also become part of the solution, in terms of coaxing them to consider different options? The other factors as well that we found through that engagement is that there are many people in the town who do want positive change. Through adopting the right engagement processes, you can actually draw out the silent majority who do want positive change in their own local communities and across the wider areas in which they live and work. So the challenge and the opportunity is to actually draw on those people who do want to see positive change, not just the vocal opposition. And of course, one thing that is characterised by local democracy is that you do get very strong voices, and we need to ensure that the whole community is taken on that journey with us. So a bit of a long answer. Hopefully it got there.
No, I think it's an important one. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to a different question now, because I think that one was specifically for you. And I think this could be a nice one for James. One of the biggest issues is the current culture that views car ownership as a symbol of high social status. And how can we start to speak back against this idea? So James, coming from the economic heartland, I thought this was a good one for you. And it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts, whether you think this is still the case, because I was hoping with younger generations this might be changing, but is that so?
I can't claim to be a sociologist or a behavioural economist, but I definitely recognise that as a challenge. I think there is a view of the car as social status, and to some degree this goes back quite a long way. You know, we had a prime minister who famously made a quote about if anyone on a bus over the age of 25 is a failure, effectively. So there's this there's a long-term kind of perception of buses as not being a particularly good way to travel. What we've seen, though, in a number of localities across our region, and I'm going to pick on Oxfordshire because, you know, I'm from there effectively, is we've had enormous amounts of investment into the buses in Oxford, and they've become very high quality. They've got great information on them. The bus stops are quite well maintained. You can charge your phone on there. They're clean, and congestion willing. They kind of run on time. So we've had quite a kind of good mode share on buses in Oxford for quite some time, and that's actually grown as the quality of the bus infrastructure and bus vehicles have grown. So I think what we need to see is really an improvement in the mode, the alternative mode, making them cheaper, making them high quality, and we'll start to see that mode shift. In terms of moving people away from vehicles as a status symbol, it's a really difficult one because we're bombarded, you know, from the moment I wake up and turn the telly on, if I'm so inclined to do so, I have wonderful car adverts telling me that, you know, I need to be driving on these wide open roads in Italy in my brand new car. So we don't really have them for buses or trains or bikes. So we are, as humans, inevitably susceptible to that sort of advertising. So there needs to be a fundamental shift in the way that that's viewed. And finally, going on to Louise's point, you know, about rural, you know, if there's simply no alternative, it's a really difficult thing to do, to move people away from the mindset that the car is absolutely almost impossible to live without. I'm not sure I've answered your question there, but as some things to think about, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you. But I've got a question actually that feeds in really nicely to this one, and I might ask Louisa to have a first go at it, and especially James, as you mentioned Louisa's points in your answer just there. So Louisa, how can we reduce emissions quickly enough when the government is doing everything it can to build more roads and drive up emissions, and preventing new roads from being refused planning permission on carbon emission grounds? Did that make sense? I don't know if I read that very well. Maybe I'll read it again. How can we reduce emissions? So did you get it?
Yeah, no, I did get the gist of the question. Okay, I think it is about bravery in decision making on a local level as well as on a national level. And I think the solutions are there. You know, we know what needs to be done. We know, we know what we can achieve. I think we've seen an underinvestment in public transport services, in particularly, and buses are very close to my heart because I think they are the workhorse of the transport world. They go everywhere. You can quickly make changes to them, and they are the public transport mode that has the greatest potential to reach all areas of the county, while rail is obviously restricted by, you know, where the rail lines are, where the stations are. Obviously very important role as well. The bus does go everywhere and we can reach people, but what we are seeing in rural areas is there often isn't a bus. Where we have bus services, they're very infrequent. They might be daytime only, so you can't use them at night. So if you can't get home when you work a bit longer or you go out in the evening, you need to take a taxi suddenly because the bus is not running, well then you may take the decision that you do need a car. So living car-free in rural areas is very difficult, and that's only your relatively frequent services that go every day. I mean, we've got services in rural areas that go twice a week, you know, to go shopping. So, and that really is not an alternative to the car. So as long as we don't change that, I think it's very, very difficult. And I think then also, yeah, we do need to consider where are the braver demand management solutions as well. Who are we providing space for in our cities? You know, how are we managing parking? How, you know, so there are some very difficult decisions that need to be made, but I think we are aware of what the solution needs to look like. It's yeah, we just need to get on with doing it.
That's a really important point. And Alex, I just wondered if you had anything to add to that, or whether you had any thoughts on how we can get on and do it, rather than just talking about it.
Just clarify in terms of the question about the decarbonising transport with a road with support for road building.
Yeah.
It's a wonderfully unloaded question. I think that the challenge with the question about do we need new infrastructure or not, and where we put in our housing, is it's that need for greater integration between the land use, the land use planning and transport. I think which is needed. So new development will need new infrastructure. That's not a question. You can put stuff even on brownfield land. When you're doing that development, it's going to need a transport system within that. I think the question is what are the assumptions we're making about how those peoples are going to travel. And so it's when we're thinking about the design of that new infrastructure and what the carbon costs of that going to be, is really thinking about that. Now, that is not only dependent on the design of that infrastructure, how people are going to use that infrastructure is dependent on your wider transport policy. I think that's the challenge we've seen, is where we've looked at trying to have new development that supports sustainable transport. It's kind of done in an isolated way. So some of the garden kind of village concepts that have been developed, and developers come along and they'll develop this wonderful place that has a cycling network, and it has a chip shop, it has a pub, it has a some offices it might even have, and then of course the developer will say, well, all these people who live here will only stay here and they will use all these local facilities. And then actually people move in, and they move in with their cars because they live in a society which values cars, and they want to get a job that's not in this place, it's actually down the road because they already had a job. And I think it's it's not just getting the new infrastructure right, it's getting the wider transport strategy right as well. I think that needs to be more joined up. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I have another follow-up question, which I think fits nicely with this. So the transport industry has been considering congestion management, promoting and supporting behaviour change, and looking at innovative measures like demand responsive transport for years, or even decades, without leading to carbon emissions reductions across the piece. What needs to change in our approach to ensure that we really do achieve the change required? So follow-up question, I think, really, but I think it gives an opportunity to elaborate more on these really important points. Jonathan, do you want to have a first go at that?
Well, I'm going to be pretty blunt here, and I think most of us would say we actually need to be rebalancing the costs of travel. Ultimately, travel is to drive demand, and it responds to costs and the costs of the choices. So we need to dramatically be improving the viability, the attractiveness, and the quality and the cost of using alternatives to the car. But ultimately, the modelers amongst us, when we're looking at what drives modal choice, they'll be knowing that the most important factor is the cost of travel by car. And let's be blunt. We currently have a government that is promoting, obviously, caps on the fuel price escalator, at the same time that we have costs in travel, rising costs in travel by bus. So ultimately, the most important factor that is going to drive change is rebalancing the costs of different modes, and that is going to include more effectively pricing for travel by car. And indeed, it's quite encouraging to see that DfT is talking about this in terms of demand management, in terms of local authorities are going to have to start thinking proactively about the costs and the provision of the parking, but also there is in some areas going to be scope for introducing charging schemes. So we're seeing the nascence of this with some of the the clean air zones, obviously with a very different agenda in mind, but I think that charging has to be on the agenda now.
Excuse me, I was just coughing, so forgive me for that.
Creating shock, shock and awe.
Exactly, it was, totally. Thanks, Jonathan. James, I think you wanted to come up with a follow-up comment to that.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, I think road pricing is a matter of when, not if. So it's sort of when and how. We know that that's being debated by a number of the APPGs and kind of select committees. So that it's going to happen. I mean, and how that's applied is a really interesting discussion to have. But I think going back to Jonathan's key point about the cost of travel, if we look at the average cost of a season ticket across many of our European counterparts, you're talking under €500, about $1 a day to travel anywhere within a region. This is the sort of scale of change that we need to be seeing in terms of the cost to access different modes, and it's not rocket science, this, but it's quite a fundamental shift in the way that our transport is paid for, and the way that our treasury is involving itself in kind of placemaking in terms of the economic opportunity that transport offers, which is again into the point that I was making when I was having my little chat earlier on, was we need to be removing the silos between treasury, between DFT, between DLUC. All parts of government need to be collaborating around this, particularly around the cost of transport.
And I think that's a great note to finish on. I wish we had more time. I wish we could hear more from all of you and take more of the questions, but sadly we don't have time for that today. My understanding is the slides will be circulated. And I just want to say a huge thank you. Thank you to Jonathan, Louisa, Alex, James for your fantastic contributions. Thank you everybody for listening, and thank you to Atkins for making this possible. So thank you so much, and hope to see you all again.